Hello, everyone. I'm David Vaucher. Welcome to the Business of Motorsport podcast powered by Vaucher Analytics. In this historical transition towards electric vehicles, it's always been my view that legacy automakers have been very reactive with regards to the Chinese challenge. That is to say, that they're trying to catch up to strengths that China has on a playing field where they may never actually catch up. And so, my secondary view to that is that I always wish there had been some model that legacy automakers could use to frame the current challenge in a way that would allow them to play to their current strengths, or at least see how participants in this other model have addressed it. Now, I know that sounds a little bit roundabout, but it's going to be very clear when I get into the topic of this show, which I'm calling the Sheinification of the automobile industry. Now, when discussing the rise of Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers, the conversation usually focuses on supply side factors, things like time to market, subsidy structures, battery supply chains, and aggressive industrial policies. Now, all of these factors matter, of course, but focusing exclusively on the supply side risks missing the deeper issue entirely. Understandably, because Chinese manufacturers execute extraordinarily well on the supply side, most analysis focuses there. But the real disruption and the key for legacy automakers may actually rest on the demand side. Supply side prowess alone cannot explain why consumers have become so receptive to the model, and yet this is the focus. In fact, France, which has a storied car industry, just released a highly detailed report on its current state, which nevertheless completely omits the demand side of the market. I've talked about this in a previous episode of the Business of Motorsport, and I'll of course link that in the show notes. Consumers around the world are increasingly behaving in ways that reward the exact type of automotive ecosystem Chinese manufacturers in all industries, not just automotive, have optimized themselves to serve: fast moving and tailored around affordability, speed, and value per dollar. This is why comparisons between the automotive industry and fast fashion are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. But before you get too up in arms, there are, of course, some obvious caveats. The danger facing the automotive sector is not necessarily that cars become bad. In fact, many Chinese EVs are objectively impressive products. And I want to repeat that. These are objectively impressive, good products. The danger is that the entire market begins reorganizing itself around a consumer expectation that cars should become continuously refreshed, price sensitive products optimized primarily around value. Because this is not how cars have ever really been marketed. In other words, the problem facing legacy automakers may not be the Chinese competition directly, but rather the industrial paradigm that China has established over decades in other consumer facing industries, such as clothing. The automotive industry is now undergoing its own Sheinification, and whether or not legacy automakers survive rests on acknowledging this. This is the analog model I was talking about early on in the show. Unfortunately, if the apparel industry is any indication, there may be no going back, at least not without a very diligently implemented plan. So first, let's talk about what Sheinification actually means. Now, the term should not be interpreted as a criticism of any particular country or company. Rather, it describes a broader economic phenomenon that has already transformed multiple industries. Fast fashion fundamentally changed the relationship consumers had with clothing. Historically, clothing was expensive because manufacturing garments required skilled labor, time, and relatively limited production capacity. Consumers bought fewer items, kept them longer, repaired them more frequently, and attached greater value to craftsmanship and durability. Today, many consumers increasingly prioritize very different attributes, things like constant novelty, rapid trend cycles, extremely low prices, acceptable rather than exceptional quality, and near instant availability. Now, the system evolved to satisfy those expectations, and as a result, the clothing industry, anywhere but the haute couture and custom tailoring levels, increasingly optimizes for targets such as supply chain speed, manufacturing scale, trend responsiveness, low cost production, and algorithmic merchandising. Even European companies such as H&M, rather than trying to deliver affordable clothing on the old established terms, leveraged the Chinese supply chain because, crucially, this transformation to ultra-low-cost clothing was not caused solely by manufacturers. It was enabled by demand, and those manufacturers responded. Consumers embraced the new model because it offered affordability, convenience, and variety. Social media accelerated the trend further because low prices enabled the appearance of Shein haul videos on TikTok. Coincidentally, another Chinese product favoring speed and quick turnover, which in turn drove more demand and only accelerated the price cycle downwards. And the automotive industry is now in a similar transition. Here's a key point though. Everyone is looking at technology as the analog, but almost nobody is looking at apparel. The obvious comparison for modern EVs is consumer electronics, and it is a cliche at this point to say that an electric vehicle, or really a car generally, is a computer or smartphone on four wheels. Screens dominate interiors, over-the-air updates continuously change the ownership experience long after delivery, and even the exterior shapes of the cars themselves are converging towards the equivalent of the glass and aluminum devices that rarely change and which have no room for the whimsy of earlier Nokia and Sony phones. This paradigm doesn't just show up in how the final products look. In the same way that Henry Ford brought the automobile to the masses thanks to the lowered cost structure that assembly line production enabled, so has China been able to lower the cost structure again by treating car manufacturing in the same way as smartphone manufacturing. This was the final piece of the Sheinification of the car industry. Whereas before Chinese EVs, consumers looking for transportation had to buy what was available to them under the old model, they now have considerably lower priced, but still, again, very good options available to them. And because consumers have already become accustomed to prioritizing affordability, convenience, and rapid product cycles in other industries such as clothing, Chinese EVs suddenly, and I'm using scare quotes here, look like an existential threat to the car industry. But in fact, there's nothing sudden about this. These consumer preferences developed over decades, and in that time frame, legacy car makers have, let's be honest, become complacent thanks to their incumbent status, raising prices and going upmarket. It could, in turn, also take decades to undo these preferences unless legacy car makers understand that they are fighting the same fight as those selling upmarket trench coats and boots when Shein sells items which basically do the job for considerably less money. Now, here's the problematic wrinkle in my analogy that I've already alluded to, but it's worth really focusing on, and that's that Chinese EVs are often good and really, really good. One of the biggest analytical mistakes Western commentators make is assuming the rise of Chinese EVs can be dismissed purely as a subsidy story. That would be comforting, but it is increasingly difficult to defend. Indeed, if subsidies were the only thing keeping the industry alive, it would not look nearly as vibrant as it does now. The recent Beijing Auto Show featured nearly 1,500 vehicles, all showing off some combination of cutting-edge infotainment systems, luxurious interiors, and of course, aggressive pricing compared to legacy equivalents. It is highly likely that even if legacy automakers catch up and create completely equivalent models, the differences in cost structures will mean a persistent, call it 30% gap to Chinese vehicles. Furthermore, while China can't keep chasing the same efficiency gains year over year, it is nevertheless highly likely that its brands will nevertheless become more efficient still in the future. And in a Sheinified market increasingly optimized around value per dollar expectations, legacy automakers may never catch up. So this is the terminal endgame for them. To be clear, this is a demand problem that no one has solved yet, certainly not clothing manufacturers. Today, there is a market for more premium clothing, but mass market purchasing behavior still overwhelmingly favors affordability and convenience. The Swiss watch industry is somewhat of an exception in how it has managed the pivot, but it followed the shrink to grow path, and it would take an extremely brave executive board at an automobile maker to go down this road. I've talked about this extensively before, and I'll link that as well in the show notes. So, the most dangerous outcome for legacy automotive manufacturers is not merely losing EV market share temporarily, it is losing the ability to justify its pricing in perpetuity. For decades, legacy brands relied on a combination of heritage, engineering reputation, motorsport success, craftsmanship, emotional identity, and perceived durability to sustain higher margins and differentiate themselves from their competitors. Consumers were not simply buying transportation. They were buying symbolism, trust, identity, and the promise of long-term ownership value. However, brands also just priced cars a certain way because they were settled into a comfortable competitive ecosystem. Now, The arrival of Chinese EVs has completely upended the chessboard, and decades of Chinese manufacturing elsewhere have made consumers very receptive to what its companies have to offer in terms of transportation. So it's my view that the future of the industry will be driven on consumer values that will not change in the short term, if at all. Ultimately, the future of the legacy automotive industry may depend less on battery chemistry and more on consumer psychology. Industrial systems do not exist independently from the people who buy products, and markets optimize around what consumers consistently reward over time. If consumers continue prioritizing low prices above all else, constant upgrades, feature per dollar maximization, and increasingly disposable ownership patterns, then the automotive industry will inevitably reorganize itself around those expectations. Manufacturers will optimize for speed, affordability, rapid iteration, and continuous refresh cycles because those are the behaviors that the market rewards. But to do this would be a mistake for legacy automakers. They do, after all, have decades of heritage and intangible goodwill on which to rely if they leverage those attributes properly. A different future remains possible if enough consumers continue valuing longevity, emotional design, craftsmanship, motorsport heritage, repairability, ownership pride, and engineering depth. So that's to give you an idea of just how much goodwill these legacy automakers have. Those preferences can create economic space for manufacturers capable of offering something beyond pure functional transportation. But Shein is still around, the costs for everything keep going up, and legacy automakers have a very difficult road ahead of them. And that is it for today's episode of the Business of Motorsport podcast. I really hope you enjoyed the show. And as usual, I want to thank you so much for spending your time here with me. If you want more additional context around what I've talked about in this episode, please do visit the show notes. I'll have all of the extra detail linked down there. Again, I want to thank you so much for choosing to spend your time with me. And I really look forward to speaking with you on the next episode of the Business of Motorsport podcast.